This baby was found by a millionaire in a toilet bowl at an airport, but what happens next is even more shocking. Comment what you think will happen and subscribe to the channel to support my work. The rain lashed against the windows of the international airport as Richard Sterling absent-mindedly watched the planes land on the wet runway. At 42, the successful businessman had everything money could buy, but his face, etched with deep circles under his eyes and a weary expression, revealed that something heavier than his luggage accompanied him that morning. He checked his expensive wristwatch again, annoyed by his flight's delay. The last few months had been especially difficult. The recent divorce, the sleepless nights thinking about the daughter he hadn't seen in years, the deals that seemed to drain more and more of his energy. He needed to get home soon, back to his controlled and predictable routine. The airport terminal was relatively empty on that rainy morning. Richard got up to stretch his legs, walking aimlessly among the closed shops. His cell phone vibrated in his pocket, another message from his lawyer about the division of assets in the divorce. He deleted it without reading. He didn't want to think about it now. That's when he heard the screams. They came from the hallway to his right, echoing through the empty corridors of the airport. A cleaning lady came running, her face contorted in panic. "Help! There's a baby! A baby in the bathroom!" she screamed in desperation, gesturing frantically towards the women's restroom. Richard felt his blood run cold. Without thinking twice, he ran in the direction the woman indicated. Other airport. Employees began to approach, but he was the first to enter the bathroom. What he saw made his heart stop. In one of the stalls, partially submerged in the dirty water of the toilet, was a tiny baby. The child wasn't moving, its skin pale with a frightening bluish tinge. "My God!" exclaimed Richard, rushing to the stall. Without hesitation, he plunged his arms into the icy water and lifted the baby carefully. The child was cold, its lips purple, and it made no sound. With trembling hands, Richard took off his suit jacket and wrapped the baby in it, trying to warm it. He began to massage the small chest gently, praying silently that it wasn't too late. "Come on, little one. Breathe," he murmured, tears streaming down his face without him even noticing. "Please breathe." The seconds dragged on like hours. The baby remained motionless in his arms. Richard could hear excited voices around him, someone shouting for an ambulance, hurried footsteps, exclamations of horror. But none of that mattered. His whole world was reduced to that small life in his arms, struggling to survive. And then, like a miracle, the baby moved. A tiny movement, almost imperceptible, followed by a weak moan. Richard released the breath he hadn't even realized he was holding. "Thank God," he whispered, gently squeezing the child against his chest. The baby began to cry, a weak but full of life sound. It was at that moment, while trying to soothe the child's crying, that Richard noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. Just below the baby's right eye, there was a small heart-shaped birthmark. The world seemed to spin around him. That mark, it was identical to the one his daughter Nina had when she was born. The same daughter he hadn't seen in years since his ex-wife disappeared, taking her with her after a terrible fight. "Sir, sir, the ambulance is arriving," a distant voice called him back to reality. It was the cleaning lady, now calmer, though still visibly shaken. Richard nodded mechanically without taking his eyes off the baby. The child had calmed down a little, though it was still shivering from the cold. He wrapped it even more in his jacket, trying to protect it. "It's a girl," said the employee, who was now approaching with a clean towel. "I found this with her." She held out a small piece of crumpled, wet paper. Richard took it with his free hand, trying to decipher the words blurred by the water. It was a note written in haste. "Forgive me, I have no choice. Please take care of her." The desperate simplicity of those words hit him like a punch in the stomach. What kind of despair would lead a mother to abandon her newborn daughter like that? The sound of ambulance sirens cut through the air, approaching rapidly. Richard knew that in a few minutes the paramedics would arrive and take the baby. He should feel relief. After all, he had done his part, saved a life. He could go back to his normal life, to his appointments and meetings, but something inside him refused to simply leave that story behind. The birthmark, so similar to his daughter's, seemed like a sign of fate. Or maybe it was just his mind playing tricks, projecting his own pains and regrets onto that situation. The paramedics arrived, efficient and professional. Richard quickly explained what had happened, handing the baby over to their care. He watched as they examined her and prepared her for transport. "Is she going to be okay?" he asked, surprised by the pleading tone in his own voice. "Thanks to your quick action, the chances are good," replied one of the paramedics. "But she needs immediate hospital care." Richard nodded, feeling a tightness in his chest as he watched the little one being placed in the portable incubator. His flight would be called any minute. He should let the professionals do their job and go his way. But before he could walk away, he heard another commotion coming from outside the airport. A young woman had been found unconscious in the parking lot, apparently after trying to throw herself in front of a car. "She's pregnant," someone shouted, or was. "There's blood." Richard's heart raced. Could it be possible? Without thinking, twice he followed the second ambulance that arrived, completely ignoring the announcement of his flight that began to sound over the loudspeakers. Something told him that his life was about to change forever. And for the first time in many years, he wasn't afraid of that change. The cold lights of the hospital reflected on the pale face of the young woman lying on the stretcher. Richard watched her through the glass of the ICU, his heart squeezed by an inexplicable feeling. She couldn't have been more than 18. Her face still marked by childlike features, although her expression, even unconscious, carried a deep sadness. The doctors had confirmed his suspicions. She had given birth recently, probably no more than a few hours before. Her condition was serious, not only because of the physical injuries caused by the suicide attempt, but mainly because of the severe postpartum hemorrhage. "Are you a relative?" asked a nurse, approaching with a clipboard. "No," responded Richard, without taking his eyes off the girl. "I was at the airport when they found her." The nurse nodded, making some notes. "We found documents with her. Her name is Clara Santos, 18 years old. We tried to contact her family, but the number we have is disconnected." Clara Santos. The name echoed in Richard's mind like a distant bell. Why did that name seem so familiar to him? "And the baby?" he asked, remembering the little one he had rescued in the bathroom. "The girl who was found at the airport. Is she okay?" "Yes, she's responding well to treatment. It's a miracle, considering the circumstances. If it weren't for your quick intervention..." The nurse continued talking, but Richard barely heard her. His mind was focused on Clara, trying to understand why he felt such a strong connection to that situation. It wasn't just the coincidence of the birthmark, similar to his daughter's. There was something more. Something he couldn't explain. A movement in the room caught his attention. Clara was beginning to wake up, her eyes opening slowly, disoriented. The nurse quickly entered to examine her, but the young woman's reaction was unexpected. "My baby!" Clara cried, trying to get up. "Where's my baby?" It took 2 nurses to keep her in bed. Clara struggled, crying and screaming, her despair palpable even through the glass. "Please, let me go. I need to find her. I need to..." Richard felt his heart break seeing the girl's suffering. Without thinking, he entered the room, approaching the bed. "Clara," he said softly, "your daughter is fine. She's safe." The young woman stopped struggling, her red eyes fixed on Richard. How do you know?" "I found her in the airport bathroom. She's receiving all the necessary care." Clara burst into tears, her small body shaking with sobs. The nurses took advantage of the moment to administer a mild sedative, trying to calm her down. "Forgive me," Clara whispered, her voice choked. "I didn't want to. I had no choice. He said he would hurt her if I didn't." Her words became slower, confused. As the sedative took effect, Richard remained by her side, holding her hand until she fell asleep again. "Sir," called the nurse, "we need to ask you some questions. The police will want to investigate the abandonment." "No," Richard interrupted firmly. "This girl has been through too much already. I'm going to hire lawyers, the best ones. No one is going to criminalize a girl who is clearly in distress." The nurse seemed to want to argue, but something in Richard's expression made her change her mind. He was, after all, a man accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed. Leaving the room, Richard made several calls. He cancelled appointments, activated his legal team, arranged for Clara to be transferred to a private room with the best medical team available. While resolving these practical matters, his mind didn't stop working, trying to connect the dots. Her name, the way she spoke, even her gestures, everything seemed strangely familiar to him. He decided to visit the nursery where the little survivor was being kept. The nurse guided him to the incubator, explaining that despite the scare, the baby was surprisingly well. "She's approximately 3 months old," explained the doctor overseeing the case. "She's a little dehydrated and hypothermic, but her vital signs are stabilizing." Richard watched the little one through the glass of the incubator. She slept peacefully, oblivious to the drama surrounding her existence. The heart-shaped birthmark below her right eye seemed even more evident now. Can I see the mother's documents?" he asked the nurse. "I need to understand this situation better." The nurse hesitated, but eventually gave in to Richard's insistence. After all, he had saved the child's life and was providing the best possible treatment for mother and daughter. Flipping through the chart, Richard felt his world collapse. Clara's date of birth, her full name, the address of her last known residence. Everything fit into a terrible possibility. With trembling hands, he picked up his cell phone and called his private investigator, the same one who had been trying unsuccessfully for years to locate his ex-wife and daughter. "I need you to verify some information urgently," he said, as soon as the man answered. "Clara Santos, 18 years old, born in..." As he dictated the details, his heart beat faster and faster. It was impossible, it couldn't be. His daughter Nina should be with her mother, somewhere far away, protected and happy. It couldn't be that scared and desperate girl who had tried to take her own life. The investigator promised to return in a few hours with the information. Richard hung up the phone and returned to observe the baby in the incubator. If his suspicions were correct, that wasn't just an abandoned child he had saved by chance. It was his granddaughter. A noise coming from the hallway startled him. From his thoughts, Clara had woken up again and was having another crisis. Richard ran back to her room, only to find her trying to tear off the tubes and wires that were monitoring her. "I can't stay," she cried, fighting against the nurses. "He's going to find me. He's going to hurt my daughter." "Clara, please, calm down," Richard pleaded, approaching her. "No one is going to hurt you or your daughter, I promise." Something in his voice seemed to reach Clara. She stopped struggling and looked at him, really looked for the first time. Why are you helping me?" she asked, suspicious. "What do you want in return?" The question hit Richard like a stab in the back. What could he say? How could he explain that he suspected he was her father, that her mother had disappeared with her years ago, that his whole life had been built on lies? "I just want to help," he replied softly. "You and your daughter deserve a chance." Clara laughed bitterly, a sound that didn't match her youth. "No one helps anyone for free. I learned that the hard way." Before Richard could answer, his cell phone vibrated. It was the investigator, returning his call much sooner than expected. excusing himself, he left the room to answer. "Mr. Sterling," said the investigator, his voice tense, "you need to see this immediately. I found something about Clara Santos and about your ex-wife." Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. His worst fear was about to be confirmed, and something told him that the truth would be even more painful than he imagined. The makeshift office in the hospital was silent as Richard examined the documents that the investigator had brought. Each page revealed a more painful story than the last. Old photos, school records, police reports, all the pieces of a puzzle that he never imagined he'd have to piece together. His ex-wife, Martha, had moved to a different city shortly after the separation, taking little Nina with her. But contrary to what Richard had always imagined, they hadn't found a better life. The record showed a downward spiral of financial problems and constant changes of address. When Nina turned 12, Martha became seriously ill. Terminal cancer. Without resources and without close family, the girl ended up being left in the care of a neighbor after her mother's death. The neighbor, an elderly lady, did what she could but couldn't afford to raise a teenager. Nina, now using the name Clara, began to skip classes. Social services records indicated frequent visits, concerns about neglect, but nothing effective was done. At 15, she met Ricardo, a man 10 years older who promised to take care of her. Richard felt his stomach churn as he read the police reports. Ricardo was a known manipulator with several domestic violence complaints in his history. He had completely isolated Clara, controlling every aspect of her life. When she became pregnant at 17, the situation worsened. Ricardo abandoned her, but not before threatening her, saying that if she sought help or tried to report him, he would return to take revenge on her and the baby. "My God!" Richard murmured, running his hands over his tired face. "How did I let this happen?" "There was no way you could have known," said the investigator, who remained standing near the window. "Your ex-wife did a meticulous job of covering her tracks. She changed not only cities but states, altered documents, used false names. But why? Why do that to our daughter?" The investigator hesitated before handing over the last envelope. "We found this among your ex-wife's belongings after her death. I think it explains a lot." Inside the envelope was a diary, the pages yellowed with age. Martha's handwriting, once so familiar to Richard, now seemed strange and distant. The first entries dated back to the time of the divorce. "He'll never change," said one passage. "All the money, all the success has only made him colder, more distant. I can't let my daughter grow up like this, watching her father drift further and further away, always prioritizing business." Richard felt each word like a stab wound. It was true. At that time he was obsessed with work, convinced that securing the family's financial future was more important than anything else. "Nina asked about him again today," continued another entry, months later. "How can I tell her that her father chose work over her? Better she believe he simply abandoned us. Anger is easier to bear than indifference." The following pages recounted the deterioration of Martha's mental health, her growing paranoia, her conviction that she was protecting her daughter by keeping her away from her father. Even as the disease consumed her, she refused to reach out to Richard. "Mr. Sterling," called the investigator, interrupting his reading, "there's one more thing you need to know." Richard looked up, exhausted. What else could there be? "The baby? Your granddaughter. She has no birth certificate. Clara or Nina never checked into any hospital. The birth must have taken place at home or without medical supervision," Richard finished, feeling a new wave of pain. His daughter had gone through all of this alone, too terrified to seek help. A commotion in the hallway caught his attention. Raised voices were coming from the direction of Clara's room. Richard ran, fearing to find her in another crisis. But what he saw was even worse. Clara was standing wearing a hospital gown precariously, over her hospital clothes, trying to get past the nursing staff. "You can't stop me," she cried, her face marked by tears. "I need to leave before he finds me." "Clara, please," a nurse was trying to argue. "You're still too weak. It doesn't matter. He's going to hurt my daughter. You don't understand." Richard approached cautiously. "Clara, Nina." She froze at the sound of the name. She turned, slowly, her eyes wide with fear. How do you know that name?" "Because I'm your father," Richard said, his voice breaking, "and I'm so sorry for not being there when you needed me." Clara took a step back, shaking her head. "No, it can't be. My father abandoned us. My mother said, 'Your mother was sick, honey. She believed she was protecting you, but—'" "Liar!" Clara screamed, backing away until she hit the wall. "It's all a lie! You can't be my father. My father didn't care about us. He—" Her legs gave way and she began to slide down the wall. Richard ran to support her, but she pushed him away with all the strength she could muster. "Don't touch me! You abandoned us! Where were you when Mom died? Where were you when I needed—" Her voice failed and she covered her face with her hands, sobbing. The medical staff took advantage of the moment to approach with a syringe of sedative, but Richard gestured for them to wait. "You're right," he said, keeping his distance, but not taking his eyes off her. "I failed as a father. I was so focused on building an empire that I didn't see what really mattered falling apart. When your mother left with you, I looked, but not enough, not in the right way." Clara continued to cry, but something in her posture had changed. She was listening. "I can't change the past," Richard continued. "I can't erase all the bad things that happened to you, but I can be here now. I can protect you and your daughter, if you allow it." "Why?" Clara asked, her voice small and broken. "Why now?" "Because fate gave me a second chance when it put your daughter, my granddaughter, in my arms in that bathroom, and this time I won't fail." Clara finally raised. Her face, her eyes, meeting Richard's. The fear was still there, but there was something else, a small spark of hope. "He's going to find us," she whispered. "Ricardo. He said that if I told anyone—" "He'll never get near you again," Richard guaranteed, his voice filled with iron determination. "You have my word." Clara took a hesitant step towards him, then another. When she finally allowed Richard to hug her, her whole body was trembling. "Dad," she murmured, the words sounding strange and familiar at the same time. "I'm so scared." "I know, my daughter, I know, but now you're not alone anymore." As he held her, Richard silently swore that he would do anything to protect his newfound family. But little did he know that his problems were just beginning. Because at that very moment, elsewhere in the city, Ricardo discovered that Clara had survived and began to plan his revenge. The days at the hospital dragged on with an almost palpable tension. Clara alternated between moments of apparent acceptance and deep anxiety attacks. Her physical recovery progressed well, but the emotional trauma was a wound much more difficult to heal. Richard practically moved into the hospital. He turned a small waiting room into his makeshift office, from where he coordinated his business remotely while keeping a watchful eye on his daughter and granddaughter. The nights were the worst. Clara often woke up screaming from nightmares, reliving moments of terror that she still didn't have the courage to share completely. On one of those particularly difficult nights, Richard found her sitting on the bed, hugging her knees and rocking back and forth. "Want to talk?" he asked gently, sitting in the armchair next to the bed. Clara continued rocking for a few moments before answering. "I dreamed about the day I found out I was pregnant," she said finally, her voice almost a whisper. "I was so scared, but also happy, you know. I thought maybe a baby would change things, make Ricardo really love me." Richard felt his heart clench, but he remained silent, letting her continue. When I told him I'd never seen Ricardo so angry, he said I'd done it on purpose, that I was trying to trap him. He pushed me against the wall, started yelling that he was going to teach me a lesson. Her words were interrupted by sobs. Richard wanted to hug her, protect her, but he knew that at that moment she needed to let out all that pain. I managed to escape that night. I stayed on the streets for a while, sleeping in shelters, doing odd jobs to get food. Some people tried to help, but I was so scared. Ricardo had eyes everywhere. He always found out where I was. She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. When Nina was born, it was in a cheap boarding room. The landlady helped me with the delivery, but I barely had money for the basic supplies for the baby. Ricardo kept stalking me, sending threatening messages. "Why didn't you go to the police?" Richard asked gently. Clara laughed, a bitter and joyless sound. "He has friends on the police force. At least that's what he always said. And then, after what happened to the last girl who tried to report him," her voice failed, and she began to tremble violently. Richard couldn't take it anymore. He got up and sat on the edge of the bed, wrapping her in his arms. This time, she didn't resist. "Forgive me," Clara sobbed against his chest. "Forgive me for trying, for almost—" "Shh," he murmured, stroking her hair as he used to when she was little. "You're not to blame for anything. You were desperate, alone." "But I abandoned my daughter. What kind of mother does that?" "A mother who was trying to protect her daughter in the only way she could find," Richard replied firmly. "Clara, look at me." She raised her face, her eyes tearful. "You're much stronger than you think. You've survived things that no one should go through, especially alone, but now you're not alone anymore. I'm going to help you get through this one day at a time." A soft baby's cry interrupted the conversation. It was Nina, in the nursery, adjacent to the room. Clara immediately straightened up, her maternal instinct momentarily overcoming her own suffering. Can I see her?" she asked hesitantly. "Of course you can. She's your daughter." The nurse brought Nina, who was already more rosy and healthy after days of intensive care. Clara received her in her arms with a mixture of love and fear. "What if I'm not a good mother? What if I don't know how to take care of her properly?" "No one is born knowing," Richard replied. "But you've already shown that you would do anything to protect her. That's a good start." Nina opened her little eyes, focusing them on Clara. The small, heart-shaped mark below her right eye seemed even more evident under the soft light of the room. "Mom also had a mark like that," Clara said softly. "She always said it was a mark of love." Richard felt his throat tighten. "Yes, your mother had one, and you also had one when you were born, but it disappeared over time." Clara looked at him surprised. "Really? I didn't know. Mom never mentioned—" "There were many things your mother chose not to mention," Richard said with a sigh. "She was sick, Clara. Not just physically, but emotionally, too. She truly believed she was protecting you by keeping you away from me." "She always said you didn't want us," Clara murmured, cradling Nina gently. "That you only cared about money and power." "And she wasn't entirely wrong," Richard admitted. "I was obsessive about work. I believed that giving you financial security was more important than being present. When your mother left taking you, it was like a slap in the face. But when I finally realized my mistake, it was too late," Clara completed. "Yes, but now I have a second chance. We have a second chance." Nina began to whimper, and Clara instinctively adjusted her better in her arms, whispering sweet words. It was incredible how, despite all the trauma and fear, her maternal instinct remained intact. "You know," said Richard, watching the scene with emotion, "you were exactly like that as a baby. Always calmed down, when you heard a soft voice. "Really?" asked Clara, a small smile appearing on her lips. "Tell me more. What was I like?" Richard began to share memories of Clara's early years, before everything went wrong. He talked about her first words, her first steps, how she loved it when he took her to play in the park, in the rare moments he took off work. The night went on as they talked, father and daughter reconnecting through long-buried memories. Nina slept peacefully in her mother's arms, oblivious to the significant moment unfolding. But the peace of that moment would be brutally interrupted the next morning. Because while Clara was finally beginning to feel safe, Ricardo had already discovered where she was, and his plan for revenge was about to be put into action. Outside the hospital, hidden in the shadows, he watched the illuminated window of Clara's room, a cruel smile forming on his lips. Soon she would learn that no one abandoned him without paying a high price, a very high price. That night, for the first time in days, Clara managed to sleep without nightmares. But her real nightmare was just beginning. The morning began with a strange feeling in the air. Clara woke up restless, even though she had slept better than in previous nights. Something wasn't right, although she couldn't explain exactly what. Richard had left early to resolve some urgent issues at the office, promising to return before lunch. The nurse brought Nina for her morning feeding, and Clara tried to focus only on that moment with her daughter, ignoring the anxiety growing in her chest. "She's doing great," commented the nurse, smiling as she saw how vigorously Nina was feeding. "She's gained weight, and all the tests are normal. Soon, you'll be able to go home." Home! The word echoed in Clara's mind with a mixture of hope and fear. Her father had insisted that they live with him, at least initially. He had a large apartment with 24-hour security and all the comfort they needed. But the idea of leaving the safety of the hospital terrified her. "Miss Clara," called a voice from the door. It was Rose, the social worker who had been following her case. "Can we talk for a bit?" Clara nodded, adjusting Nina better in her arms. Rose entered and sat in the armchair next to the bed, her usually serene face wearing a worried expression. "Clara, I need you to be completely honest with me," Rose began softly. "We received a complaint, someone claiming that you're unfit to care for Nina." Clara's blood ran cold. "What? Who said that?" The person preferred to remain anonymous, but presented some evidence. Photos of you on the streets, records of stays in shelters, the airport incident. "No," Clara murmured, clutching Nina to herself. "They can't take her from me. They can't." "No one is going to take your daughter," Rose assured, although her tone wasn't entirely convincing. "But we need to assess the situation. You have a history of emotional instability, a suicide attempt." "I was desperate," Clara interrupted, tears streaming down her face. "I had nowhere to go. I was scared." "I understand, Clara, but our concern is for the well-being of the child. Your father suddenly appeared offering help, but until we can fully verify the situation..." Clara barely heard anymore. Her world was collapsing again. There was only one person who could be behind this, a person who knew all the details of her past on the streets. Ricardo. As if reading her thoughts, Rose continued. "The complaint mentioned an abusive relationship, threats." "Clara, if you're being coerced in any way..." "No," Clara cut in. "I'm not. My father is helping me. He wants the best for us. Please, you can't take my daughter." Nina began to cry, frightened by her mother's agitation. Clara tried to calm her, but her own hands were trembling so much that she could barely hold her properly. "Let me help," offered Rose, holding out her arms to take the baby. "No!" Clara screamed, recoiling in the bed. "Don't touch her! No one is taking my daughter from me!" The noise attracted the nurses, who came running into the room. Clara was in total panic, now sobbing and shaking while Nina cried, frightened. "Clara, you need to calm down," Rose tried. "No one is taking Nina now. We just need to make sure that—" "Liar," Clara interrupted. "You're going to take her, like you took Joanna's baby." Rose frowned, confused. "Joanna?" "A girl I met on the streets," Clara explained between sobs. "She also fled an abusive relationship. She was also pregnant. Ricardo found her, and when she tried to report him, he... Her voice failed, overcome by a new wave of sobs. The nurses exchanged worried glances, one of them discreetly preparing a syringe with a sedative. "What happened to Joanna, Clara?" Rose asked gently. "He destroyed her. He used his contacts, made up stories, made it look like she was addicted to drugs. They took her baby as soon as it was born. Joanna couldn't take it. Clara couldn't finish, but she didn't need to. Her tormented look said it all. "Clara, listen," Rose said, leaning forward. "If this man is threatening you, we can help. There are protection programs." "No," Clara cut in. "You can't protect me from him. No one can." At that moment, Nina let out a louder cry, and Clara automatically began to rock her, whispering words of comfort. It was impressive how, even in the midst of panic, her maternal instinct remained intact. "Just look at you two," Rose said softly. "It's obvious how much you love your daughter, Clara, and that's exactly why you need to let us help. Your father seems sincerely worried about you, but we need to follow legal procedures." "My father!" Clara exclaimed, remembering suddenly. "I need to talk to him, please." Rose hesitated but eventually nodded. One of the nurses left to call Richard, while the other remained nearby, still discreetly holding the syringe with the sedative. The minutes dragged on like hours. Clara cradled Nina, who had finally calmed down and was now sleeping in her arms. Her own panic had given way to a chilling, calculating fear. She knew Ricardo too well not to recognize his way of acting. First the anonymous complaint, then would come the evidence carefully planted. Witnesses paid to tell stories about her unstable behavior, maybe even drugs found among her belongings at the hospital. "I won't let it happen," she murmured to herself. "I won't let you win this time." The door opened and Richard entered hurriedly, his face etched with worry. Seeing Clara hugging Nina, silent tears streaming down her face, he felt his heart clench. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice automatically assuming the authoritative tone he used in important meetings. Rose stood up, maintaining a professional posture. "Mr. Sterling, we received a concerning complaint about—" "What kind of complaint?" he interrupted. "And based on what?" "Sir, I understand your concern, but we have an obligation to investigate any allegation of—" "And I have an obligation to protect my daughter and my granddaughter," Richard cut in. "Clara is under medical care, receiving all the necessary psychological support. She has a home waiting for her, security, comfort. What kind of complaint could justify further traumatizing a young mother who has already been through so much?" Rose seemed disconcerted for a moment, but soon regained her composure. "Mr. Sterling, with all due respect, your daughter's history— my daughter's history is that of a teenager who was abandoned, abused and stalked," Richard interrupted again. "And now that she has finally found safety, you want to use her past against her?" Clara watched the scene in silence, a strange feeling growing in her chest. Is this what it was like to have someone defending you? Someone strong enough to face the world for you? "Dad," she called softly. When Richard turned to her, she continued, "It was him. Ricardo is behind this." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. When he opened them again, there was an iron determination in his eyes. "Rose," he said, turning to the social worker, "I think we need to have a more detailed conversation about this situation, in private." Rose nodded, although she still seemed hesitant. Before leaving the room with Richard, she turned to Clara. "No one is going to make any rash decisions, Clara. I promise we'll analyze all aspects of the situation." When she was alone with Nina, Clara allowed some tears to escape. But they were no longer tears of despair, they were of determination. "He won't win," she whispered to her sleeping daughter. "Not this time. We're not alone anymore." But as she cradled Nina, Clara couldn't imagine that the worst was yet to come. Because Ricardo wasn't a man to give up easily, and his plan was only just beginning. The meeting with Rose stretched on for hours. Richard had summoned his lawyers and was methodically presenting every document, every piece of evidence of Ricardo's history of abuse and Clara's transformation since she found family support. Meanwhile, Clara remained in her room, her heart tight with worry. Nina slept peacefully in the crib next to the bed, oblivious to the storm brewing around her. The nurse had insisted on giving Clara a mild sedative, fearing she would have another crisis. "I need to be strong," Clara murmured to herself, watching her daughter sleep. "For you, my love. I need to be strong." Her thoughts were interrupted by a gentle knock on the door. It was Maria, the oldest nurse on the floor, who had taken care of Clara since her arrival at the hospital. "How are you feeling, honey?" asked Maria, approaching to check Clara's vital signs. "Scared," Clara admitted. "But not like before. It's different now." Maria smiled gently as she noted the measurements on the clipboard. "Of course it's different. You're not alone anymore." Clara nodded, silent tears streaming down her face. "You know, Maria, for so long I believed that I didn't deserve help, that I deserved all the bad things that happened to me." The nurse sat on the edge of the bed, her kind eyes fixed on Clara. "Ricardo made you believe that, didn't he?" "Yes," Clara whispered. "He said that no one else would accept me, that I was damaged goods, and I believed it. Even after I ran away, I kept believing it. And now?" Clara looked at Nina, then at the closed door behind which her father was fighting for them. Now I'm starting to think that maybe he was wrong, that maybe I deserve a second chance." Maria smiled, gently squeezing Clara's hand. "Everyone deserves a second chance, honey, especially someone with so much love to give as you." At that moment, Nina began to stir in the crib, mumbling softly. Clara immediately leaned over to pick her up, her movements already showing more confidence. "See?" commented Maria, watching how Clara naturally adjusted Nina in her arms. "That maternal instinct, that love, no one can take that away from you." Clara cradled Nina, who soon calmed down upon recognizing her mother's familiar warmth. The small, heart-shaped mark under her eye seemed to shine under the soft light of the room. "Did you know that when I was a baby, I had a mark just like this?" "One," Clara said, gently running her finger over Nina's face. "My father told me. He said it disappeared over time, but that my mother always said it was a mark of love." Maria watched the scene with emotion. In her 30 years as a nurse, she had seen many sad stories, but also witnessed moments of redemption and healing, like that one. "Clara," she called softly, "can I tell you something?" Clara looked up, curious. "When you arrived here, after the incident at the airport, you were so scared, so closed off. You could barely look at Nina without starting to cry. But now, just look at you two." Clara lowered her eyes to her daughter, who was staring at her with that solemn look typical of babies. "Sometimes I'm still so scared of not being good." "Not for her. Honey, being a mother is being scared every day," said Maria with a wise smile. "The important thing is not to let fear paralyze you." The conversation was interrupted by raised voices coming from the hallway. Clara recognized her father's voice, louder and firmer than usual. Instinctively, she squeezed Nina closer to her chest. The door opened and Richard entered, followed by Rose and a man Clara didn't know. Her father looked exhausted, but there was a glimmer of triumph in his eyes. Clara, he said, approaching the bed, I want you to meet Dr. Torres. He's a psychiatrist and he's going to help us. Clara looked suspiciously at the man, who maintained a serene and professional expression. Help how? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Dr. Torres has extensive experience in cases of trauma and abuse, Richard explained. He's going to make an independent assessment of your psychological condition to counter any unfounded accusations that may arise. Rose cleared her throat, looking uncomfortable. Miss Clara, I want you to know that we are not here to harm you. Our only concern is the well-being of the child. And what would that well-being be? Asked Clara, her voice taking on a firmer tone. Taking her away from me, putting her in the system like they did with Joanna's child? Clara, Dr. Torres interjected softly, no one here wants to separate you from your daughter. On the contrary, we want to ensure that you two have all the support necessary to build a healthy life together. Clara studied the doctor's face, looking for signs of lying or manipulation, a skill she had painfully developed in her years with Ricardo. But she only found sincerity in his eyes. What do I need to do? She asked finally. For now, just talk, replied Dr. Torres. Tell me your story, in your own time. No pressure, no judgments. Clara looked at her father, who nodded encouragingly, then at Maria, who smiled with that maternal way that always made her feel safe. Okay, she agreed at last, but Nina stays with me. Of course, the doctor assured. No one is going to separate you. And as everyone organized themselves for the first evaluation session, Clara couldn't imagine that conversation would reveal much more than she expected, because buried under years of trauma and manipulation, there were memories that she herself didn't know she possessed, memories that could change everything. And somewhere in the city, Ricardo received a call that made him grind his teeth in anger. His initial plan had failed, but he still had other tricks up his sleeve. Clara might have found protection, but he knew exactly how to hit her where it hurt the most. The war for Nina's future was just beginning. The first session with Dr. Torres lasted almost 3 hours. Clara spoke until her voice was hoarse, describing not only the years of abuse with Ricardo, but also childhood memories that she had long buried. Nina remained surprisingly calm throughout, as if she sensed the importance of that moment. I remember the day Mom said we needed to leave, Clara said, rocking Nina distractedly. I was 6 years old, I think. She was very agitated, throwing clothes into suitcases, saying we couldn't stay there anymore. And your father, Dr. Torres asked gently, do you remember him at that time? Clara frowned, trying to organize the hazy memories. He worked a lot. He was always in meetings, trips, but when he was home... She paused, a confused expression on her face. Yes, the doctor encouraged. What happened when he was home? He played with me, Clara said slowly, as if the memory were emerging. For the first time, he took me to the park. I had a special swing just for me, and he always called me Little Princess. Tears began to stream down her face. How could I forget that? Mom always said that he didn't care, that he only thought about work and money. But it wasn't quite like that, was it? Dr. Torres made some notes before responding. Our minds sometimes block memories, especially when we are very young and go through traumatic situations. Your mother was sick, Clara, not only physically, but emotionally too. She genuinely believed she was protecting you. But she pushed me away from the only person who could have helped us, Clara whispered. And then, after she died... Her voice failed, and Nina, sensing her mother's agitation, began to whimper. Clara automatically adjusted the baby in her arms, murmuring words of comfort. It's impressive, commented Dr. Torres, observing the interaction, how your maternal instinct remains strong, even in moments of emotional stress. Clara looked at her daughter, a small smile appearing amidst the tears. It's like when I'm with her, a part of me knows exactly what to do, even when my head is a mess. That's very significant, Clara. It shows a natural ability for care and protection, even after years of trauma and abuse. Nina had calmed down and was now playing with a strand of Clara's hair, completely trusting in her mother's arms. "You know what's funny?" Clara said after a moment of silence. "Ricardo always said that I was incapable of taking care of myself, let alone a baby, that I was weak, unstable, and you believed him." "Yes, for a long time, yes. Even after I ran away, his words kept running through my head. When I found out I was pregnant, my first thought was that he was right, that I was going to screw everything up, that I wouldn't be able to." "But you didn't screw everything up," the doctor observed gently. "On the contrary, you did the impossible to protect your daughter." Clara kissed Nina's head softly. "When she was born, it was like something changed inside me. I was still scared. I still felt incapable, but I had to try for her." Dr. Torres made some more notes before continuing. "Clara, I want you to tell me about the day at the airport. What really happened?" Clara felt her body stiffen. It was the first time someone had asked her to describe in detail that terrible day. I hadn't slept for days," she began hesitantly. "Ricardo had found me again. He was sending messages, saying he was going to make me pay for running away, that he was going to hurt Nina." Her voice trembled, but she continued. "I had no more money. I had nowhere to go. I had heard about the airport, that there was always movement, that maybe someone would find Nina in time." "In time for what, Clara?" the doctor asked gently. "Before he found us," she whispered. I thought that if I left her where someone could find her, maybe she would have a chance at a better life. Away from him, away from me." The tears were now flowing freely down her face. "But when I put her there, when I saw my baby in that horrible place, something inside me broke. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think, I just wanted it all to end." "That's when you tried." "Yes," Clara interrupted, not wanting to hear the words. "But I failed at that too, like I failed with Nina." "I disagree," said Dr. Torres firmly. "You didn't fail, Clara. You were in an impossible situation, without support, without resources, being stalked by an abuser. The fact that you and Nina survived is a testament to your strength, not your weakness." Clara looked at him, surprised by the conviction in his voice. "But now," continued the doctor, "now you have support. You have your father, you have a medical team, you have resources to rebuild your life. The question is, are you ready to accept that help?" Nina chose that moment to let out a small yawn, her little eyes beginning to droop with sleep. Clara adjusted her better in her arms, a gesture as natural as breathing. "Yes," she answered finally. "For her, for both of us. I'm ready." Dr. Torres smiled, making a final note. "Then that's what I'm going to record in my report. A young mother who, despite a history of severe trauma, demonstrates a strong bond with her daughter and is actively seeking help to overcome her challenges." Clara felt a wave of relief wash over her body. That means they're not going to take her away from me?" "Based on what I observed today, I see no reason to separate you and Nina. In fact, I believe it would be extremely harmful to both of you. What you need is ongoing support, regular therapy, and a safe environment to recover and grow together." At that moment, a soft knock on the door announced Richard's return. He entered cautiously, as if he feared interrupting something important. "Is everything okay?" he asked, noticing Clara's red eyes. "Yes, Dad," she replied, surprising herself with the naturalness with which the word Dad came out of her lips. "Everything's okay." But as father and daughter exchanged a look of mutual understanding, outside the hospital, a dark car parked. Ricardo watched the illuminated window of Clara's room, a cruel smile forming on his lips. "Enjoy it while you can, honey," he murmured to himself. "Tomorrow, you'll learn that no one abandons me without consequences." The morning brought with it a sense of hope that Clara hadn't felt in a long time. Dr. Torres's report had been conclusive, strongly recommending that she and Nina remain together with regular psychological follow-up and family support. Rose, the social worker, finally seemed convinced that the best thing for the child was to stay with her mother. Richard had spent the night at the hospital, sleeping uncomfortably in the armchair in the room. Clara watched him now, his face relaxed in sleep, a few strands of grey hair falling over his forehead. It was strange how, in such a short time, his presence had become so fundamental, so comforting. Nina slept peacefully in her crib, her little hands occasionally moving in her dreams. Clara couldn't stop looking at her, still marveling at every little detail of her daughter. "Good morning," Richard murmured, waking up slowly. "Did you sleep well?" Clara nodded, a small smile on her lips. "Better than in the last few days." "Dr. Torres called earlier," he said, adjusting himself in the armchair. "He said we can start preparing for discharge, maybe even tomorrow, if everything continues to go well." Clara's smile wavered a little. "Dad, are you sure you really want us living with you? I don't want to be a burden. Bring problems." "Clara," Richard interrupted firmly, getting up to sit on the edge of the bed. "You are my daughter. Nina is my granddaughter. You're not a burden, you're my family. The family I thought I had lost forever." Silent tears began to stream down Clara's face. "It's just, for so long I thought you didn't care, that you had abandoned us." "I know," Richard sighed, taking her hand in his. "And part of that is my fault. I was so obsessed with work, with success, I didn't see that I was losing what really mattered until it was too late." "Mum said you only cared about money," Clara said softly. "But now I'm starting to remember different things. How you took me to the park after work even though you were tired. How you always read stories to me before bed." Richard smiled sadly. "I tried to compensate for my absences with those moments, but it wasn't enough. I know that now. Your mother had reasons to be hurt with me, but she didn't have the right to keep me away from you completely," Clara completed, a new understanding in her voice, "to make me believe that I wasn't loved." Nina chose that moment to wake up, her little face contorting before letting out a soft cry. Clara immediately moved to pick her up, but Richard was faster. "Let me take my little granddaughter," he said, lifting Nina with a surprising delicacy for a man of his size. "Good morning, little princess. Did you sleep well?" Clara watched, moved, as her father rocked Nina naturally, murmuring sweet words. The baby soon calmed down, looking at him with that solemn expression typical of newborns. "Did you know that your mother had exactly the same look when she was a baby?" Richard commented, sitting down carefully with Nina. "Always so serious, as if she was studying the world." "Really?" Clara asked, approaching to adjust Nina's blanket. "Tell me more. What was I like?" Richard began to share memories of Clara's early years, stories that she herself didn't remember or that she had distorted over time. He talked about her first words, her first steps, how she loved it when he came home from work and twirled her in the air. The morning passed quietly, father and daughter reconnecting through these shared memories. A nurse came to do the routine checkups, commenting on how Clara seemed stronger, more secure. "The apartment is all prepared for you," Richard said at one point. "I had one of the rooms adapted as a nursery. I hope you don't mind, but I chose some furniture, clothes." "Dad," Clara interrupted, her voice choked. "You didn't need to." "Of course I needed to. That's 18 years of birthday presents, Christmases, and special moments that I missed. Let me try to compensate a little." Clara was about to answer when a commotion in the hallway caught her attention. Raised voices, hurried footsteps. Her heart immediately raced. Years of abuse had developed in her a sixth sense for danger. "Dad!" she called urgently. "Something's wrong." Richard had also noticed the strange movement. He stood up, still, holding Nina in his arms, positioning himself instinctively between the door and Clara. The door opened abruptly, and Rose entered, her normally calm face now marked by worry. "Clara," she said, trying to keep her voice controlled, "we need to talk. Some complications have arisen." "What kind of complications?" Richard asked, his tone making it clear that he had no patience for more problems. Rose hesitated, looking nervously at the hallway. "Maybe it's best if we talk in private." "No," Clara cut in, getting out of bed. "Whatever it is, you can say it in front of my father." Rose sighed deeply before continuing. "We received a more serious complaint with documents, witnesses." "Let me guess," Clara interrupted bitterly. "Ricardo." "Not directly," Rose replied. "But yes, he's involved." "Clara, he's claiming paternity of Nina, and he has evidence suggesting that you tried to extort him, threatened to prevent him from seeing his daughter if he didn't pay a significant amount." Clara felt the blood run cold in her veins. "What? That's a lie. I never—" "He has messages, Clara, emails, witnesses who say they heard you threatening to end his life if you didn't receive money, and more—" Rose paused, clearly reluctant to continue. "More what?" Richard pressed, his voice dangerously calm. He's claiming that the incident at the airport was an attempt by you to force him to pay, that you deliberately put Nina's life at risk to extort money from him." Clara staggered, her legs giving way. Richard quickly passed Nina to Rose and ran to support his daughter before she fell. "This is absurd," he thundered. "My daughter was running away from him. He abused her. He threatened her." "I know," Rose said softly, "but he has a very different story to tell, and unfortunately, he has evidence that seems to support his version." Clara clung to her father's arm, trembling violently. "He's going to succeed, isn't he? He's going to take her away from me." "No," Richard declared firmly. "He won't. I won't allow it." But as he held his trembling daughter, as he watched his granddaughter in Rose's arms, Richard knew that the battle that was to come would be the most difficult of his life. Because Ricardo wasn't just attacking Clara, he was attacking the whole family that Richard had just recovered. And outside the hospital, invisible in the shadows, Ricardo smiled. His plan was working perfectly. Soon, very soon, Clara would learn the true meaning of the word revenge. The nightmare that Clara so feared was becoming a reality. In the hours following Rose's visit, the hospital room turned into a makeshift operations center. Richard had summoned his best lawyers, who were now meticulously examining every document, every alleged piece of evidence presented by Ricardo. Clara watched, everything with a mixture of terror and exhaustion. Nina slept in her arms, completely oblivious to the chaos unfolding around her. Every now and then, the baby stirred in her sleep, and Clara squeezed her a little tighter, as if her embrace could protect her daughter from everything that was to come. "These messages," said one of the lawyers, examining a stack of papers, "have clearly been manipulated. Look at the dates, the inconsistencies in the text." "But it's going to take time to prove that," argued another. "And in the meantime, he may get a temporary court order." "No," Richard interrupted firmly. "We're not even considering that possibility. My daughter and my granddaughter are not going to be separated." Clara felt silent tears streaming down her face. It was surreal to see all those people mobilized to help her, when so recently she had been completely alone in the world. Clara called Dr. Torres, who had also been summoned for the emergency. "I need you to tell me exactly what your relationship with Ricardo was like. Every detail may be important." Clara took a deep breath. adjusting Nina more comfortably in her arms. Before beginning, I was 15 years old when I met him. I was living with Mrs. Zephyr, a lady who took me in after I was left alone. She did what she could, but she barely had enough money for herself. Her voice trembled a little, but she continued. Ricardo appeared like a savior. He was older, he had a good job. He treated me like a princess at first. He said he was going to take care of me, that I would never have to worry about anything again. How did he gain your trust? Dr. Torres asked gently. Gradually. First, they were small gifts, a chocolate, a new outfit for school. Then he started paying some of Mrs. Zephyr's bills, buying food. I felt so grateful, so special. Clara stopped, swallowing a sob before continuing. I didn't realize how he was isolating me. First, there were subtle comments about my friends, that they weren't good company, that they only wanted to take advantage of me. Then he started saying that Mrs. Zephyr was exploiting me, that I shouldn't trust her. And you believed him. Yes, Clara whispered, the shame evident in her voice. I believed everything. When he suggested that I go live with him, it seemed like the most natural thing in the world. Mrs. Zephyr tried to stop me, said that there was something wrong. But I didn't listen. Nina stirred in her arms, mumbling softly. Clara automatically began to rock her, a gesture that now came naturally. When did things start to change? Dr. Torres asked, making notes. It was gradual. First there were outbursts of jealousy if I took too long at school, if I talked to a classmate. Then he started controlling my cell phone, my clothes, even what I ate. Clara closed her eyes, the painful memories flooding her mind. The first time he hit me, it was because I replied to a message from an old friend. He said I was being ungrateful, that after everything he had done for me, I was still disrespecting him. And you didn't try to seek help? From whom? Clara asked bitterly. There was no one left. He had made sure of that, and whenever I threatened to leave, he reminded me that I was underage, that no one would believe me. Richard, who had remained silent during the account, couldn't contain a choked sob. Clara looked at him, surprised to see tears in her father's eyes. Forgive me, he said in a hoarse voice. If I had looked for you more, if I hadn't given up. No, Dad, Clara interrupted. It wasn't your fault. Mom did everything she could to make sure you didn't find us. And then I myself got lost. Dr. Torres cleared his throat softly before continuing. Clara, when you found out you were pregnant, how did Ricardo react? Clara's body tensed and she instinctively squeezed Nina closer to her chest. He was furious. He said that I had done it on purpose, that I was trying to ruin his life. He pushed me against the wall, started yelling. I had never seen him so violent. Her hands trembled as she continued. It was that night that I ran away. I was so scared, not for what he could do to me, but for the baby. I took the little money I had hidden and left without looking back. And during the pregnancy, did he try to find you? All the time, Clara whispered. He sent messages, threatened me, said that if I didn't come back, he would make sure. I never saw my baby again, that he was going to prove that I was crazy, unstable, like he's doing now, completed one of the lawyers grimly. Clara nodded, tears streaming silently down her face. But there's one thing I don't understand, she said after a moment. How did he get all this false evidence? The messages, the emails. I never tried to extort money from him, never. Technology can be manipulated, explained one of the lawyers. With the right programs, it's possible to create entire conversations that look real, and unfortunately, Ricardo seems to have the resources for that. But we're going to prove it's all a lie, Richard assured, approaching to hug Clara, and, Nina, I'm not going to let him hurt you again. At that moment, Nina woke up, her little eyes opening slowly. Seeing her mother's face, she broke into a small smile, her first real smile since she was born. Clara felt her heart melt. "Look, Dad, she's smiling." Everyone in the room stopped to observe the precious moment. It was as if Nina, in her innocence, was reminding everyone what they were fighting for. But the peace of the moment was brutally interrupted by a loud knock on the door. Rose entered, her face pale and worried. "Clara," she said hesitantly, "Ricardo is here, with a court order." The terror that Clara felt at that moment was different from anything she had ever experienced. Because this time, it wasn't just her life at stake. It was the life of her daughter, her little Nina, who had finally learned to smile. The silence that followed Rose's announcement was deafening. Clara squeezed Nina against herself so tightly that the baby began to whimper, sensing her mother's tension. "He can't come in here," Richard declared, placing himself instinctively between the door and his daughter. "This is a hospital, not a court." "He has a temporary court order," Rose explained, her voice trembling slightly. "He claims that Clara represents a risk to Nina and demands immediate supervision of all interactions between mother and daughter." "This is ridiculous," exploded one of the lawyers. "Based on what evidence? We need to see that order." But before Rose could respond, a familiar and terrifying voice sounded from the hallway. "Based on evidence, more than sufficient evidence, that this young woman is mentally unstable and represents a danger to my daughter." Ricardo entered the room, and Clara felt her whole world freeze. He was exactly as she remembered, tall, well-dressed, with that smile that to others might seem charming, but that she knew hid a calculated cruelty. "Clara," he said softly, as if he were talking to a stubborn child, "it didn't have to come to this. If you had been reasonable from the beginning—" "Don't come near her," Richard warned, his voice filled with an authority that made even Ricardo hesitate for a moment. "Ah, yes, the absent father who suddenly decided to show up," Ricardo replied with disdain. "Where were you when your daughter needed you? When she was living on the streets?" "Don't you dare," Richard began, but was interrupted by Clara. "Stop," she said, her voice surprisingly firm, despite the tremor in her body. "Don't try to use my father against me, Ricardo. Not this time." Ricardo raised his eyebrows, feigning surprise. "Use? Honey, I'm just stating facts. Like the fact that you tried to extort me, threatened to prevent me from seeing my daughter if I didn't pay—" "Liar!" Clara screamed, and Nina began to cry for real. "You know it's all a lie. I ran away because you hit me when I told you about the pregnancy, because you said you were going to teach me a lesson." "Clara, Clara," Ricardo sighed, taking a step towards her. "See how out of control she is. That's exactly why we need this court order, to protect little Nina from your outbursts." Dr. Torres, who had remained silent until then, stepped forward. "As the psychiatrist in charge of the case, I must inform you that Clara has demonstrated remarkable emotional stability and a strong maternal bond with the child. Any outburst, as you put it, is a natural response to the trauma of the abuse. She suffered." Ricardo laughed, a cold and calculated sound. "Trauma, abuse, doctor, with all due respect, but you're being manipulated. Clara has always been unstable. I tried to help her, give her a home, security. And how did she thank me? By running away, preventing me from seeing my own daughter." "His daughter," Richard interjected. "The same one you wanted her to get rid of when you found out about the pregnancy?" Ricardo narrowed his eyes. "More lies. I have witnesses who can confirm how I always supported the pregnancy, how I tried to convince Clara to accept proper medical help." "Bought witnesses," retorted one of the lawyers, "just like your forged evidence." "Forged?" Ricardo feigned indignation. "Everything is properly documented. The emails, the messages, Clara threatening me, demanding money." "Enough," Clara said softly, but with a firmness that made everyone turn to her. "Enough lies, Ricardo." She stood up from the bed, still holding Nina, who had calmed down and was now looking around with those solemn eyes that so reminded them of hers. For years, I believed you. I believed you when you said that I was worthless, that no one else would accept me. I believed you when you said that it was all my fault, that I deserved every push, every slap. Her voice trembled a little, but she continued. But now, I have something more important than my fear of you. I have my daughter, and unlike you, who only wants to use her to hurt me, I actually love her. Ricardo took another step towards her, his face beginning to show the anger that Clara knew so well. Be careful what you say, honey. Don't want to make your situation even worse. Or what? Clara challenged. Are you going to hit me again? In front of all these witnesses? In front of your own lawyer? Ricardo stopped, clearly not expecting that reaction. For a moment, his mask of civility wavered, and everyone in the room could see a glimpse of the true violence that hid behind his calculated smile. You can't stop me from seeing my daughter, he said finally, his voice filled with veiled threat. I have my rights. What rights? Clara asked. The rights that you invented with false documents, the rights that you bought. With dirty money? Nina chose that moment to stir in her mother's arms, turning to look at Ricardo. The small, heart-shaped mark under her eye seemed to shine under the light of the room. Just look, Ricardo said, his tone changing to something falsely sweet. She already recognizes her father. No, Clara cut in. She doesn't recognize you as anything, because you are nothing to her, never were, never will be. Ricardo's mask fell completely. His face contorted in an expression of pure fury, and he lunged towards Clara with his fist raised. But before he could take another step, several things happened at the same time. Richard placed himself in front of his daughter. The lawyers moved to stop Ricardo, and Dr. Torres quickly activated the emergency button on the wall. I think we just had a perfect demonstration of your true character, said Dr. Torres calmly as hospital security guards came running into the room. Ricardo looked around, realizing too late that he had lost control. His outburst of anger had revealed his true nature in front of important witnesses. This isn't over, he hissed as he was escorted out. You're going to regret this, Clara. You're going to regret this bitterly. When the door closed behind him, Clara finally allowed her legs to buckle. Richard supported her, guiding her back to the bed. It's over, he murmured, hugging his daughter and granddaughter. He showed who he really is. Now we have witnesses. But Clara knew that it wasn't over. She knew Ricardo too well to believe that he would give up so easily. That outburst of anger had been just the beginning. And as she cradled Nina, who was now sleeping peacefully in her arms, Clara wondered what price she would have to pay for having finally found the courage to face him. The hours following Ricardo's departure were a whirlwind of activity. His outburst had completely changed the legal landscape of the situation. Dr. Torres and the other professionals present in the room gave detailed testimonies about the incident, documenting the attempted assault and the threatening behavior. Clara remained silent, cradling Nina and watching all the movement with a mixture of relief and apprehension. She knew Ricardo too well to believe that this would be the end. We need to transfer you as soon as possible, Richard said, hanging up the phone after another call. I've already arranged additional security for the apartment. I don't know if it's a good idea to leave now, Clara replied hesitantly. Ricardo must be waiting for that. Richard sat down next to his daughter, taking her free hand in his. Clara, look at me. We can't live in fear of him forever. You yourself said there's something more important than your fear now. As if ununderstood they were talking about her, Nina opened her little eyes, focusing them on her mother's face. Clara felt her heart clench as she saw that look so trusting, so innocent. You're right about one thing, said Dr. Torres, approaching. The bed. Ricardo is probably waiting for you to leave. That's why we prepared a plan. Clara looked up, curious. The doctor continued. The official transfer is scheduled for tomorrow morning. That's what's on the hospital records, what Ricardo will probably find out through his contacts. But, Clara asked, realizing that there was more. But you're leaving tonight, completed Richard. In another car, through another exit. Maria is going to help. As if she had been summoned, the oldest nurse on the floor entered the room, pushing a wheelchair. Her kind face was serious but determined. I've already prepared everything, she said. The shift is changing now. It's the perfect time. Most of the staff are busy with the change of shift. Clara looked at the wheelchair, then at her father. Are you sure it's going to work? It has to work, he replied simply. I'm not going to risk your safety. Maria approached, holding out her arms. Let me hold the little one while you get ready. Clara hesitated for a moment, her protective instinct screaming not to let go of Nina. But this was Maria. The same. Maria, who had taken care of her since day one, who had dried her tears and listened to her stories. Okay, she finally agreed, carefully passing Nina into the nurse's experienced arms. While Clara changed in the bathroom, putting on plain clothes that her father had provided, she could hear the muffled voices in the room, discussing the last details of the plan. Her hands trembled slightly as she buttoned her blouse. You can do it, she murmured to her reflection in the mirror. For her, you can do it. When she came out of the bathroom, she found Nina back in her father's arms. The scene made her heart melt. Richard was holding his granddaughter with so much care, so much love. Ready? He asked softly. Clara nodded, unable to trust her voice at that moment. She sat down in the wheelchair, and Maria gently placed Nina in her arms, tucking a blanket over both of them. Keep your head down, instructed the nurse, as if you're focused only on the baby. The fewer people who see your face, the better. Dr. Torres opened the door, checking the hallway. It's clear. Let's go now. The journey through the hospital corridors seemed to last an eternity. Clara could feel her heart beating so hard that she was sure everyone could hear it. Nina, miraculously, remained quiet, as if she understood the need for silence. They used the service elevator, descending to the basement where the hospital laundry was located. The smell of disinfectant and clean clothes was strong, but Clara barely noticed, focused only on controlling her breathing and keeping Nina comfortable. Almost there, whispered Maria, pushing the chair through a narrow corridor. Finally, they reached a metal door, apparently without anything special. But when Maria opened it, it revealed a small loading and unloading area where a discreet car waited with the engine running. This is where we part ways, said Maria, helping Clara to get up from the chair. God bless you, honey. Clara hugged, the nurse with one arm, while holding Nina with the other. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Take care of this little princess, replied Maria, giving a soft kiss on Nina's head. And of yourself, too. Richard was already at the wheel, and one of the lawyers occupied the passenger seat. Clara got into the back seat, where a baby car seat had been installed. Let me help, offered Maria, helping Clara to settle Nina in the car seat. The baby grumbled a little but soon calmed down. When they were finally ready to leave, Clara felt silent tears streaming down her face. It was strange. After everything she had been through, all the nights of terror with Ricardo, all the deprivations on the streets, she was crying now, just when she was about to find safety. Everything is going to be okay, said her father, looking in the rearview mirror. Trust me. The car began to move slowly, leaving the loading area. Clara stared fixedly at Nina, memorizing every detail of her serene little face. The small heart-shaped mark under her eye seemed more visible in the dim light of the car. That's when they heard the sound of screeching tires. A car came out of nowhere, blocking their exit. No! Clara whispered, the panic growing in her chest. as she recognized the vehicle. "It's him." A tense silence took over the car as they watched Ricardo get out of his vehicle. Even in the low light, Clara could see the cruel smile on his face. That same smile that so often preceded moments of violence during their relationship. "How did he find out?" Clara whispered, her body trembling as she instinctively leaned over Nina, as if she could protect her just with her body. "There must be someone informing him inside the hospital," replied the lawyer in a low voice. "Mr. Sterling, what do we do?" Richard kept his hands firmly on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on Ricardo, who was now walking slowly towards the car, like a predator circling his prey. "Clara," he said, his voice calm but filled with urgency, "when I start the car, I want you to duck down with Nina. Don't get up until I tell you to." "Dad, no," Clara began, but was interrupted by the sound of knocking on the driver's window. "Let's make this easy," said Ricardo, his voice muffled by the closed glass. "I know. She's in there, with my daughter." Nina began to cry, frightened by the tension in the environment. Clara tried to calm her, but her own hands were trembling so much that she could barely hold the baby. "Mr. Sterling," said the lawyer tensely, "he can't do anything. He doesn't have any valid court order after what happened at the hospital." "Court order?" Ricardo laughed, having obviously heard the comment. "You really think I need papers to get my own daughter?" It was then that Clara noticed something that made her blood run cold. Ricardo wasn't alone. 2 men had gotten out of his car and were now positioning themselves strategically, blocking any route of escape. "Dad," Clara whispered, the panic evident in her voice. "He brought reinforcements." Richard nodded imperceptibly without taking his eyes off Ricardo. "I know, honey, but we have too." As if those words were a signal, lights came on around them. From various points in the parking lot, figures emerged from the shadows, private security guards that Richard had hired, positioned strategically for this moment. Ricardo's expression changed, the confidence giving way to anger when he realized he had fallen into a trap. "You think some security guards are going to stop me?" he snarled, punching the car window. "She's my daughter! Mine!" "No," Clara said, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. "She never was yours. She never will be." Ricardo seemed surprised to hear her voice. The same voice that once trembled with fear now carried an iron determination. "Clara, Clara," he sighed, adopting that condescending tone she knew so well. "Haven't you learned yet? Don't you understand that you can't run away from me?" "I'm not running," she replied, holding Nina firmly in her arms. "Not anymore. I'm protecting my daughter from the man who almost destroyed us." Ricardo's mask of civility completely crumbled. His face twisted into an expression of pure fury, and he began to punch the glass harder. "You're not taking her from me," he bellowed. "I'll destroy you. His threats were interrupted by the sound of sirens. Police cars began to enter the parking lot, their blue and red lights illuminating the scene like a macabre show. "That's right," Richard said calmly. "While you were busy following us, we were busy contacting the authorities, with witnesses to your violent behavior at the hospital, recorded threats, and now this attempted ambush." Ricardo recoiled, finally realizing the gravity of the situation. His reinforcements were already being approached by the police officers, clearly unprepared for a confrontation of this level. "It's over, Ricardo," Clara said, her voice now firmer. "This time you lost." Nina had stopped crying and was now looking around with that solemn expression that so resembled her mother. The small, heart-shaped birthmark under her eye seemed to glow under the lights of the patrol cars, like a symbol of hope. "Ma'am," called a police officer approaching the car. "Is everything all right in there?" Clara looked at her father, who nodded encouragingly. "Yes," she replied, "it is now." As Ricardo was led away by the police officers, still shouting threats, Clara allowed the tears to finally fall. But this time, they were tears of relief. "Is it really over?" she asked softly, more to herself than to the others. "This part is," Richard replied, finally relaxing in the driver's seat. "But our story is just beginning." Clara looked at Nina, who was now sleeping peacefully in her arms, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. Yes, she thought, this was just the first page of a new story. A story of recovery, of healing, of love. But as the car finally left the hospital parking lot, Clara couldn't imagine that there was still one last chapter to be written. Because Ricardo might be in jail, but his secrets that involved not only Clara, but her entire family. It was still to come to light, and when the truth finally emerged, nothing would ever be the same. The days following Ricardo's arrest were a period of adjustment for Clara and Nina. Richard's apartment, while spacious and comfortable, felt like another world compared to everything Clara had known in recent years. The elegant furniture, the stunning city view, the 24-hour security. It was all so different from the precarious life she had led on the streets. The nursery Richard had prepared for Nina was a dream in soft shades of green and yellow. A light, wood crib, a musical mobile with small birds, shelves filled with children's books and stuffed animals. Clara often found herself standing in the doorway, watching her daughter sleep, still barely believing it was real. "Can't sleep?" Richard asked one night, finding her once again watching over Nina's slumber. Clara shook her head slightly. "It's strange, spending so much time having to be always alert, always ready to run. Now I can't relax even, knowing we're safe." Richard approached, placing a protective arm around his daughter's shoulders. "It will take time, dear. Trauma doesn't disappear overnight. Sometimes I'm afraid of waking up and finding out it's all a dream," Clara confessed, her voice almost a whisper. "That I'm still in that dark room with Ricardo, or on the streets running." "It's not a dream," Richard assured, squeezing her gently. "We're here, we're together, and nothing will change that." Nina stirred in the crib, mumbling softly in her sleep. Clara automatically leaned over to adjust her blanket, a gesture that already came naturally. "You know," Richard said, watching the scene with emotion, "you do exactly as your mother did. She also spent hours watching you sleep, adjusting your blankets." Clara felt a pang in her chest. "Tell me more about her, Dad. What was she like before she got sick?" Richard sighed deeply before answering. "Your mother was intense, in everything, in love, in anger, in convictions. When she was happy, her joy lit up the whole room. When she was sad, it was as if the whole world was ending," Clara completed softly. "Exactly. In the beginning, it was part of what attracted me to her, that passion for life, that intense way of feeling everything. But over time, it got harder. She started having increasingly extreme mood swings." Clara listened attentively, trying to piece together her own fragmented memories with the story her father told. "When you were born," Richard continued, "it was as if something changed in her. She became even more protective, more possessive. She started seeing threats everywhere. I tried to convince her to seek help, but she refused." "Is that why she threw herself so much into work?" Clara asked. "To escape the situation?" Richard closed his eyes, the guilt evident in his expression. "Partially, but also because it was easier to deal with numbers, contracts, and meetings than to face that I was losing my family." Nina chose this moment to wake up, her little eyes opening slowly. Seeing her mother and grandfather, she flashed one of her recently discovered smiles. "Hey, little princess," Clara murmured, picking her up. "Did you have good dreams?" That's when she noticed something strange, a small white envelope partially hidden under the crib. She frowned, confused. "Dad, did you leave a letter here?" Richard also frowned. "No." "Why?" Clara bent down, still holding Nina, and picked up the envelope. There was nothing written on the outside, but something inside her told her it was important. With slightly trembling hands, she opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age. The handwriting. She would recognize it anywhere. "It's from Mom," she whispered, feeling her heart race. Richard took Nina from Clara's arms, allowing her to focus on the letter. He sat down in the nursing chair, watching as his daughter began to read. "My dear Clara," the letter read, "if you are reading this, it means that you have finally found her way back home. I know you must hate me for what I did, for keeping you away from your father, for all the lies I told." Clara had to stop for a moment, tears blurring her vision. She took a deep breath before continuing. "But I need you to know the truth. It wasn't just the illness that consumed me. There was something else, something I discovered shortly before. I decided to leave, something about your father, about his family." "What does she mean?" Clara asked, looking at Richard. Her father seemed equally confused, shaking his head as he cradled Nina. "I have no idea." "Keep reading." Clara returned her eyes to the letter, her heart beating faster and faster. "The Sterling family hides dark secrets, my daughter. Your father may not know, or pretends not to know, but the empire they built was erected on foundations stained with blood, and when I discovered the truth, when I threatened to expose everything..." The letter ended abruptly there, as if Martha had been interrupted while writing. Clara looked at her father, who was now as pale as a ghost. "Dad?" she called hesitantly. What did she mean by that? Richard seemed to have aged 10 years in the last few minutes. I don't know, Clara, but maybe that explains a lot. What things? Your mother's obsession with our protection, the way she insisted that my family was dangerous, and especially... He stopped, as if afraid to continue. "Especially what, Dad?" "The accident," he said finally. "The accident that killed... Maybe it wasn't an accident." Clara felt the blood run cold in her veins. Nina, sensing the tension in the room, began to whimper in her grandfather's arms. But if it wasn't an accident," Clara began, her mind spinning with the implications. "Then your mother was silenced," Richard completed somberly. "And now, after all these years, the truth she tried to reveal has finally found a way." Nina's crying increased, echoing through the room like a harbinger of doom. Because although neither of them knew it yet, that incomplete letter was just the tip of a much larger and much more dangerous iceberg. The real story was about to be revealed. And when it did, Clara would discover that Ricardo was not the only monster in her life. There were others, much more powerful, much more lethal, hidden in the shadows of her own blood. The discovery of Martha's letter triggered a series of revelations that no one could have foreseen. In the weeks that followed, Richard delved into a deep investigation of his family's past, uncovering truths that had been carefully buried for decades. Clara watched her father spend hours in his office, surrounded by old documents and yellowed photographs. Nina grew a little more each day, oblivious to the whirlwind of emotions that stirred the family. "I found something," Richard said one night, entering Nina's room where Clara was lulling the baby to sleep. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he held an old folder. "What is it?" Clara asked softly, placing the sleeping Nina in the crib. "The truth your mother discovered," he replied, sitting down heavily in the armchair. "The reason she ran away with you. The reason she..." His voice failed, and Clara realized there were tears in her father's eyes. "My father, your grandfather, didn't build this fortune just with hard work, as he always made me believe. He took advantage of vulnerable people, especially young women with children. He offered help, loans, then used the debts to force them to do terrible things. Clara felt her stomach churn. What kind of things? He forced them to give up their children for adoption, children who were then sold to wealthy families who couldn't have children. It was an elaborate scheme involving doctors, lawyers, social workers. "My God," Clara whispered, her whole body trembling. "And you never knew?" "No," Richard replied, running his hands over his tired face. "He kept everything very well hidden. I was just a child when it started, and then he kept me focused only on the legitimate businesses of the family." Clara picked up one of the documents from the folder. It was a list of names, dates, and amounts. Hundreds of children, hundreds of lives destroyed. "Your mother found out when she was pregnant with you," Richard continued. "She found old documents while looking for family photos for your baby album. When she confronted my father, he threatened her," Clara completed, the pieces finally falling into place. "Yes, he said that if she told anyone, especially me, he would make sure you were taken from us. He would use his contacts, his power, to destroy us." "That's why she became so paranoid," Clara murmured. "That's why she kept saying we needed to protect ourselves." "She wasn't sick, Clara. She was terrified. And when she finally gathered the courage to write that letter, to try to expose the truth." "The accident," Clara completed, feeling nauseous. "It wasn't an accident." Richard nodded somberly. "I found records of suspicious payments, dates that coincide. My own father ordered that." He couldn't finish the sentence, sobs choking his voice. Clara had never seen her father cry like this, with so much despair and guilt. "Dad," she called softly, kneeling beside his chair. "You didn't know. There was no way you could have known." "But I should have noticed," he exclaimed. "I should have investigated more when your mother started acting strangely. I should have believed her when she said there was something wrong." Nina stirred in the crib, mumbling softly in her sleep. Clara went to her, adjusting her blanket. With care. "You know what's most ironic?" Richard said after a moment. "Ricardo. He worked for my father." Clara froze. "What?" "Yes, he was one of the many young men my father recruited to find vulnerable girls. When you ran away from home after your mother died, when you ended up on the streets, it wasn't a coincidence he found you." Clara felt her legs buckle. She needed to lean on the crib to avoid falling. He was sent to watch me? All that time to watch you and keep you under control," Richard confirmed bitterly. "My father must have found out that you were alive, was afraid that you would somehow discover the truth. But then, why did he treat me so badly? Why all that violence?" "Because Ricardo is a monster," Richard replied simply. "My father may have hired him to watch you, but the cruelty, that was his choice." Nina woke up at that moment, her little eyes opening slowly. The small, heart-shaped birthmark under her eye seemed to glow in the soft light of the room. "She has the same mark as you had when she was a baby," Richard said softly. "The same one your mother had." Clara picked up Nina, cradling her gently. "It's a mark of love. That's what Mom always said." "Yes," Richard smiled, sadly. "And it's also a mark of hope. Because despite all the evil my family has done, despite all the pain and suffering, here you are, strong, brave, a wonderful mother. And here you are," Clara completed, "a father who has finally found the courage to face the truth, to do what is right." Richard stood up, reaching out to embrace daughter and granddaughter. "I'm going to fix this, Clara. I'm going to find every family my father destroyed. I'm going to do everything I can to repair the harm he caused." "We will," Clara corrected, "together." Nina let out one of her newly discovered giggles, as if approving the moment. Clara lifted her into the air, making her laugh harder. "See? Nina agrees too. We're going to turn all this evil into something good. We're going to honor Mom's memory by doing what she always wanted. Expose the truth and help those in need. Richard watched the scene with tears in his eyes, but this time they were different tears. Because he finally understood that the true legacy of his family was not in money or power, but there, in that moment, in the love between 3 generations that had survived the worst to find the best in each other. In the months that followed, Richard kept his promise. Using his resources and connections, he began a meticulous work of locating the families affected by his father's scheme. He created a foundation in Martha's name, dedicated to helping single mothers in vulnerable situations. Clara became the public face of the foundation, sharing her story to inspire other women to find the strength to overcome their own traumas. Nina grew up surrounded by love, her smile illuminating the days even when the work seemed too heavy. Ricardo remained in jail, his connections to the criminal scheme of the past finally exposed. The Sterling Empire was completely restructured, now focused on reparation and social work. On a quiet afternoon, while watching Nina take her first steps in the garden of the new house they had bought, smaller and more welcoming than the luxurious apartment, Clara found another letter from her mother, this one hidden inside an old storybook. "My dear daughter," the letter read, "if you are reading this, it means that you have finally found your way back to the light. No matter how many shadows you have faced, how many storms you have weathered, you have survived. And more than that, you have grown, you have flourished, as I always knew you would." Clara pressed the letter against her chest, watching her own daughter play in the afternoon sun. The small, heart-shaped birthmark shone on her smiling face, a constant reminder that even in the darkest stories, love always finds a way to shine. "You were right, Mom," Clara whispered to the wind. "The truth always finds a way, and sometimes that way leads us exactly where we need to be." Nina ran into her arms, laughing that pure child's laugh. Richard joined them in the garden, and for a moment everything was perfect. Not because there were no more challenges ahead, but because they were finally facing them together as a family. A family that had learned the hard way that true power is not in money or influence, but in the courage to do what is right, in the love that survives the worst storms, and in the hope that never dies, passing from generation to generation like a small, heart-shaped mark.